The cruelest moments in life are often measured by the smallest numbers. Cold rain hammered the sidewalks of Brooklyn hard enough to blur the streetlights into trembling streaks of gold across the pavement. Naomi Carter pulled her thin gray hoodie tighter around her shoulders as she rushed toward the glowing pharmacy sign at the corner of Fulton Street, her sleeping baby pressed carefully against her chest beneath a faded blanket. The little girl's forehead burned against Naomi's neck. Every few seconds, the child let out another weak cough that sounded too small and fragile for a night this cold. Naomi pushed through the pharmacy doors just before closing time, bringing a gust of rain and freezing wind in behind her. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly while tired customers stood scattered through the aisles clutching snacks, cold medicine, and grocery bags. Naomi's sneakers squeaked against the tile floor as she hurried toward the pharmacy counter with exhausted eyes and trembling hands. "Please," she whispered softly to the pharmacist. "I am here for the prescription under Ava Carter." The older cashier adjusted his glasses before retrieving a small white paper bag from behind the counter. "That will be $37. Naomi immediately reached into her purse. Receipts. Bus passes. Loose quarters. Crumpled dollar bills softened by rainwater. She counted once. Then again slower. $26. Her stomach dropped so suddenly it almost hurt. "No," she whispered under her breath. The cashier waited impatiently while Naomi emptied every pocket she had. 2 more singles. 3 quarters. A dime. Still short. Exactly $11 short. Behind her, someone sighed loudly. Naomi glanced back briefly. A woman in an expensive cream-colored coat stood near the candy aisle holding a designer handbag against one arm, irritation already visible across her face. A businessman beside her checked his watch dramatically. Naomi swallowed hard and turned back toward the counter. "Could you please hold it until Friday?" she asked quietly. "I clean houses nearby. I get paid Friday morning." The cashier shook his head before she even finished speaking. "I cannot release prescription medication without payment." Naomi looked down at the sleeping child in her arms. Ava's tiny fingers curled weakly against the fabric of Naomi's hoodie while another small cough escaped her lips. The sound nearly broke something inside her. "Please," Naomi whispered again, voice thinner this time. "Her fever keeps getting worse." "Ma'am, I understand," the cashier said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But store policy is store policy." Another loud sigh came from behind Naomi. "Unbelievable," the woman in the cream coat muttered. "Some people always wait until the last minute." Naomi closed her eyes for one painful second. She hated this feeling more than hunger. More than exhaustion. The feeling of becoming a problem in public. Slowly, she gathered the loose coins back into her shaking hand while trying not to cry. The pharmacy suddenly felt too bright. Too small. Too quiet. "I am only short $11, she said softly, barely above a whisper now. Nobody answered. A few customers looked away immediately. One man pretended to study the greeting cards near the entrance instead of meeting her eyes. Naomi stared at the medicine bag sitting just beyond the counter, so close she could almost touch it. $11. That was all standing between her daughter and relief tonight. Then another cough shook the child against her chest. Naomi held her tighter instantly, gently rubbing the baby's back beneath the blanket while rainwater dripped quietly from the edge of her sleeves onto the pharmacy floor. And near the back of the line, a tall man dressed entirely in black finally looked up from his phone and watched her carefully for the first time. Naomi Carter stood frozen at the pharmacy counter with rainwater dripping quietly from the edge of her sleeves onto the white tile floor. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly while her baby shifted weakly against her chest beneath the faded blanket. Ava's tiny forehead still burned with fever. Naomi could feel the heat through the thin fabric of her hoodie, and every small cough from the child tightened panic deeper inside her chest. Behind her, the line grew restless. A man. Near the snack aisle checked his watch again with exaggerated impatience while another customer muttered something under his breath about people wasting time. Naomi kept her eyes lowered. Shame had a way of making even simple movements feel heavy. "Ma'am," the cashier said carefully, though his patience was beginning to wear thin, "if you cannot pay tonight, I will have to put the medication back." Naomi immediately looked up. "Please do not do that." Her voice cracked slightly despite her effort to stay composed. "She really needs it." The older cashier sighed softly and folded his arms. "I understand, but I cannot override the system." Another cough escaped the baby's tiny chest. "Weak. Fragile." Naomi instinctively rocked her daughter closer while brushing damp curls away from the child's forehead. "I am only short $11, she whispered again. The woman in the cream-colored coat let out a sharp breath behind her. "This is ridiculous," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "If you cannot afford medicine, maybe you should stop expecting strangers to rescue you every time something goes wrong." The words hit harder than Naomi expected. Not because they were new. She had heard versions of them before from landlords, employers, and people who looked at poverty as if it were a character flaw. But hearing them while holding her sick child under cold pharmacy lights made something inside her ache in a different way. Naomi swallowed hard and tightened her grip on Ava gently. "I am not asking for charity," she said quietly without turning around. "I can repay it Friday." "That is what everyone says," the woman replied with a bitter laugh. A few customers shifted awkwardly. One younger man near the refrigerator aisle looked uncomfortable enough to almost step forward, but after glancing around the room, he lowered his eyes again and stayed silent. Naomi noticed. People often wanted to help right up until helping became visible. The pharmacy suddenly felt unbearably small. Rain tapped softly against the front windows while the neon open sign reflected red across the wet sidewalk outside. Naomi stared at the medicine bag behind the counter and tried to calculate impossible options inside her exhausted mind. Maybe another bus route home. Maybe skipping groceries all week. Maybe selling the old microwave in her apartment. $11 should not have felt like a wall too high to climb. But tonight it did. "Ma'am," the cashier said again, softer this time, "I really need to close the register." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. She hated what she was about to do almost more than she hated failing. Slowly, she turned toward the line of strangers waiting behind her. Tired faces. Expensive coats. Avoided eye contact. "Could anyone please help me with $11? She asked quietly. "I will pay it back Friday morning. I promise." Silence answered her first. Heavy silence. The kind that makes a room feel colder. The woman in the cream-colored coat shook her head immediately with visible disgust. One customer pretended to answer a phone call that never rang. Another suddenly became fascinated by the chewing gum display beside the register. Naomi felt humiliation rising hot behind her eyes, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of people already looking at her like a burden. Then, from the very back of the line, a calm male voice finally spoke. "How much did you say you were short?" The room turned quiet all over again. Naomi slowly looked up toward the tall man dressed entirely in black standing near the entrance, rain still glistening across the shoulders of his coat while his dark eyes remained fixed on her with unsettling focus. The man in black did not move immediately after speaking. He simply stood near the back of the pharmacy line with rainwater still glistening across the shoulders of his dark wool coat while the fluorescent lights reflected faintly against the silver watch beneath his sleeve. Naomi Carter noticed how calm he looked compared to everyone else in the room. No irritation. No impatience. Just quiet observation. $11, she answered softly, adjusting her sleeping daughter higher against her chest. The man studied her for another moment before slowly slipping his phone into his coat pocket. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed too elegantly for a neighborhood pharmacy this late at night. His black dress shirt looked perfectly pressed despite the rain outside, And something about the stillness in his expression made the room subtly quieter without anyone understanding why. "That is all?" he asked calmly. Naomi nodded once. "I can pay it back Friday morning." The woman in the cream-colored coat let out another sharp laugh. "You are seriously entertaining this?" she asked the stranger. "People pull this kind of stunt constantly in the city." Naomi immediately looked down again, shame burning hotter across her face. "I am not trying to scam anyone," she said quietly. "My daughter is sick." The little girl coughed weakly against her shoulder as if confirming the statement herself. The man's eyes shifted briefly toward the child. Naomi noticed something change in his face then. Not pity. Something heavier. More personal. The cashier cleared his throat awkwardly behind the counter. "Sir, we are about to close." The man gave a small nod without taking his eyes off Naomi. "What is her name?" he asked. Naomi blinked slightly, caught off guard by the question. "Ava." "How old?" "2." The man looked at the child for another long second while rain tapped softly against the pharmacy windows behind him. Then he glanced toward the medicine bag sitting on the counter. "What kind of medicine is it?" "Antibiotics," the cashier answered. "And fever medication." Naomi tightened her hold on Ava protectively, embarrassed by how exposed the conversation suddenly felt. She hated when strangers discussed her problems like details in a public report. The woman behind her crossed her arms impatiently. "This is taking forever." Nobody responded to her this time. The younger man near the refrigerator aisle lowered his eyes uncomfortably while another customer quietly stepped out of line altogether, sensing the atmosphere changing in a way difficult to explain. The stranger finally stepped forward. Slow. Controlled. Expensive black dress shoes crossing the pharmacy floor with almost unsettling confidence. Naomi instinctively straightened slightly without knowing why. He stopped beside her close enough for her to notice the faint scent of rain and cedarwood on his coat. Up close, his face looked even calmer. Cold almost. But not cruel. "You said you clean houses?" he asked quietly. Naomi nodded carefully. "In Park Slope mostly." "And you intend to repay the money?" "Yes, sir." The answer came immediately. No hesitation at all. The man looked at her for another long moment as though measuring something beyond the words themselves. Most people begging for help avoided eye contact. Avoided accountability. Avoided dignity. Naomi did none of those things. Even exhausted and humiliated beneath harsh pharmacy lights, she still carried herself like someone trying very hard not to lose respect for herself. The stranger noticed. So did the cashier now. The woman in the cream coat rolled her eyes dramatically. "This is unbelievable. She is making herself look noble over $11. Naomi's cheeks burned again, but she stayed silent. The man beside her finally turned toward the woman. His expression never changed, yet something in the room suddenly tightened. "And what exactly," he asked quietly, "would you do if your child needed medicine?" The woman opened her mouth immediately, ready with another sarcastic answer. But the moment she met his eyes, her confidence faltered slightly. Because for the first time that night, someone in the room sounded far more dangerous than judgmental. The pharmacy felt unnaturally quiet after the man spoke. Rain continued tapping softly against the front windows while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but nobody in line seemed willing to interrupt whatever had just shifted inside the room. Naomi Carter stood motionless beside the counter with Ava sleeping weakly against her shoulder, trying to understand why the stranger's calm voice carried so much weight. The woman in the cream-colored coat forced a nervous laugh and folded her arms tighter across her chest. "I would not put myself in that situation to begin with," she replied sharply. The stranger looked at her for another long second. "Life does not ask permission before becoming difficult," he said quietly. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Even the cashier lowered his eyes briefly after hearing it. Naomi stared at the stranger with surprise flickering across her exhausted face. Most people either judged poverty or pitied it. Very few spoke about it like they understood it personally. Ava coughed again against Naomi's shoulder, weaker this time. Naomi immediately adjusted the blanket higher around the child and gently kissed the top of her damp forehead. The stranger noticed how instinctively protective she became despite her exhaustion. He also noticed something else. Naomi never once exaggerated her pain. Never raised her voice. Never tried to manipulate the room emotionally. Even now, standing humiliated beneath harsh pharmacy lights while strangers stared at her, she still looked more concerned about her daughter than herself. "What is your name?" the man asked quietly. Naomi hesitated for half a second before answering. "Naomi." "And your daughter?" "Ava." The stranger nodded slowly as though committing both names to memory. Then his eyes shifted toward the nearly empty bottle of children's fever medicine sticking out of Naomi's purse. The label was worn from use. "How long has she been sick?" he asked. Naomi looked embarrassed again. 3 days. "And you waited until tonight for medication?" The question sounded calm, but Naomi still felt shame rise in her chest. "I was hoping the fever would break on its own," she admitted softly. "I picked up extra cleaning shifts this week, but one client canceled." The woman behind them rolled her eyes again. "There is always some story." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. "Not out of anger." "Exhaustion." The stranger finally turned toward the cashier. "How much was the prescription again?" $37, the cashier answered immediately. The man reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Naomi quickly shook her head before he could pull anything out. "Please," she said softly. "I am not asking you to pay for everything." The stranger paused. Naomi tightened her hold on Ava while trying to stand straighter despite the humiliation crushing against her chest. "I only asked for $11 because that is all I need," she explained quietly. "I can handle the rest myself." Silence filled the pharmacy again. Even the woman in the cream coat stopped speaking for a moment. The stranger studied Naomi carefully now, and something unreadable moved through his expression. Most desperate people accepted help without conditions. Naomi still insisted on preserving dignity inside desperation. "You would really repay a stranger over $11? He asked softly. Naomi answered without hesitation. "Yes." "Why?" Her eyes lowered toward her daughter. "Because my mother taught me that poverty is hard enough already," she whispered. "You cannot survive it if you also lose your self-respect." The room went completely still. No phones moving. No irritated sighs. Even the cashier stopped pretending to organize paperwork behind the register. The stranger looked at Naomi differently after that answer. Not with pity. Not with amusement. With respect. Slow and quiet, but unmistakable. Then Ava let out another painful cough against Naomi's shoulder, and for the first time that night, the stranger's calm expression cracked almost invisibly beneath the pharmacy lights. The pharmacy no longer felt like an ordinary place. The buzzing fluorescent lights, the rows of cough syrup behind glass shelves, the rain sliding slowly down the windows outside all seemed strangely distant now, swallowed by the silence growing around Naomi Carter and the man standing beside her. Ava shifted weakly against Naomi's shoulder again, her tiny breath warm and uneven through the blanket. Naomi gently rubbed the little girl's back while trying to hide how badly her own hands were shaking. Exhaustion was beginning to settle deep into her bones. She had worked 12 straight hours cleaning apartments across Park Slope before rushing through the rain to this pharmacy, and now even standing upright felt difficult. The stranger noticed immediately. "You should sit down," he said quietly. Naomi shook her head. "I am all right." But the slight sway in her posture betrayed her. The cashier looked uncomfortable now too. Earlier, Naomi had simply been another struggling customer delaying closing time. But after hearing her speak, after watching the way she protected her child even while being publicly humiliated, the atmosphere around her had changed. "Ma'am," the cashier said more gently this time, "your daughter really should get the first dose tonight." Naomi closed her eyes briefly at the reminder. The woman in the cream-colored coat let out another impatient sigh. This entire scene is becoming dramatic over $11. The stranger slowly turned his head toward her. No, he said calmly. It became dramatic the moment people stopped seeing her as human. The room went silent again. The woman looked stunned for half a second before quickly recovering her expression. You do not even know her. I know enough. His voice never rose. Yet somehow the sentence landed heavier than shouting would have. Naomi stared down at the floor, unable to look at anyone anymore. Embarrassment pressed against her chest so tightly it almost hurt to breathe. She hated standing there feeling exposed in front of strangers. Hated that Ava's sickness had pushed her into begging beneath harsh fluorescent lights while people watched. Please, she whispered softly to the cashier. Can you at least hold the prescription until morning? The cashier hesitated. I can try, but I cannot promise. Before he could finish speaking, the stranger reached into his coat pocket and pulled out several folded bills. Naomi immediately shook her head again. No, she said quickly. I only need $11. The man looked at her carefully. You are refusing help? I am refusing charity. The distinction surprised everyone in the room. Naomi swallowed hard and adjusted Ava gently against her shoulder. I can pay for most of it myself, she explained quietly. I just came up short tonight. The stranger studied her face beneath the cold pharmacy lights. There were dark circles under her eyes. Rainwater still clung to the edge of her curls. Her hoodie sleeves were worn thin near the wrists. Yet somehow, even standing there exhausted and humiliated, she still carried herself with quiet dignity. No manipulation. No performance. Just honesty. The woman in the cream coat laughed under her breath. Pride does not pay bills. Naomi's eyes lowered again, but before she could answer, the stranger spoke first. Neither does cruelty. The woman fell silent immediately. Somewhere near the back of the store, a customer quietly placed his basket down and left without buying anything, uncomfortable with the tension filling the room. The cashier cleared his throat nervously. Sir, he said carefully to the stranger, should I complete the purchase? The man looked toward Naomi one last time. You said you would repay $11 Friday morning? Naomi nodded once. Yes. Then I will lend you $11. The wording mattered. Naomi noticed that immediately. Not give. Lend. Something inside her expression softened for the first time all night. The stranger stepped forward slowly and placed the money onto the counter beside the medicine bag. The sound of the bills touching the surface seemed to echo through the silent pharmacy. Ring up the medicine, he said quietly. And suddenly, nobody in the room looked at Naomi Carter the same way anymore. For several seconds after the money touched the counter, nobody in the pharmacy moved. The rain outside continued falling steadily against the windows while the neon open sign flickered red across the wet sidewalk, but inside the store the atmosphere had become strangely still. Naomi Carter stared down at the folded bills beside the prescription bag as though they carried more weight than money should. $11. Such a small amount. Yet somehow it felt larger than every humiliating moment she had endured that night. The cashier recovered first. Right, he said quietly before clearing his throat and reaching for the register. The sharp sound of keys clicking echoed through the silence while Naomi adjusted Ava gently against her shoulder. The little girl's breathing still sounded warm and uneven, but at least now there was medicine within reach. Naomi swallowed hard before finally looking toward the stranger beside her. Thank you, she whispered. The man gave a small nod. You are welcome. His voice remained calm, almost detached, yet Naomi noticed he still had not looked away from Ava. The woman in the cream-colored coat shifted uncomfortably behind them. Honestly, she muttered under her breath, people are too emotional these days. This time nobody agreed with her. Not even quietly. One customer near the entrance actually frowned at her before turning away. The energy inside the pharmacy had changed sides completely. Naomi could feel it. Earlier she had been an inconvenience standing between strangers and their evening. Now the room carried something closer to shame. The cashier placed the medication carefully into a small paper bag and slid it across the counter. "Make sure she gets the fever reducer immediately," he said softly to Naomi. "And keep her hydrated tonight." Naomi nodded quickly. "I will." Her fingers trembled slightly as she accepted the medicine. Relief hit her so suddenly she almost lost balance for half a second. Not because the problem was solved, but because for the first time all night, her daughter would not go home untreated. The stranger noticed the moment her shoulders relaxed slightly beneath exhaustion. He also noticed how carefully she folded the receipt and placed it inside her purse beside the remaining bills. Most people would have focused on what they received. Naomi immediately focused on repayment. "Friday morning," she said quietly while looking at him. "I will bring the $11 back." The man studied her face again with the same unreadable calmness. "You do not need to rush." Naomi shook her head immediately. "No. I gave my word." Something flickered behind his dark eyes then. Brief. Almost invisible. But it was enough to make the cashier glance at him differently. The older man suddenly seemed nervous now, though Naomi did not understand why. "Sir," the cashier said carefully, "would you like your usual receipt printed separately?" The question hung awkwardly in the air. The stranger's expression remained unchanged. No, Naomi frowned slightly. "Usual receipt?" Before she could think further, the woman behind her suddenly stiffened. Her eyes dropped toward the man's wrist where the sleeve of his coat had shifted slightly while reaching for his wallet. A dark tattoo disappeared beneath the cuff. Small. Precise. Korean lettering. The woman's face lost color almost instantly. Naomi noticed the reaction immediately. So did the cashier. The older man straightened so fast he nearly knocked over the prescription tray behind the counter. "Sir," he said again, voice noticeably tighter now, "I did not realize it was you." The pharmacy grew quiet all over again. Naomi looked between them in confusion while Ava stirred weakly against her shoulder. The stranger slowly slipped his wallet back into his coat without answering. But the silence surrounding him suddenly felt different now. Heavier. The cashier lowered his eyes respectfully. The woman in the cream-colored coat took a small nervous step backward. And for the first time since entering the pharmacy, Naomi realized the man standing beside her was not just another stranger caught in the rain tonight. Naomi Carter tightened her hold on the paper pharmacy bag while confusion slowly replaced exhaustion in her eyes. The cashier's sudden change in tone had altered the atmosphere inside the store more than the rain pounding outside ever could. Just moments earlier, he had sounded irritated and impatient. Now he stood unnaturally straight behind the register, carefully avoiding direct eye contact with the man beside her. The woman in the cream-colored coat looked even worse. Her face had gone pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting while her fingers tightened nervously around the strap of her designer handbag. Naomi glanced toward the stranger again, studying him more carefully now. He still looked calm. Almost detached from the tension surrounding him. But the room itself no longer treated him like an ordinary customer. "Sir," the cashier said quietly, "would you like me to have someone escort you to your vehicle?" The man gave a small shake of his head. No, his answer was simple, but the cashier immediately nodded as though receiving instructions from someone far above him. Naomi frowned slightly. None of this made sense. The stranger turned toward her again instead. "You should get your daughter home before the fever gets worse," he said calmly. Naomi blinked once before quickly nodding. "Right. Yes." She adjusted Ava gently against her shoulder and reached into her purse. The folded receipt crinkled softly beneath her fingers as she searched for something to write with. "Can I at least give you my number?" she asked quietly. "So I can return the money Friday?" The stranger watched her for a moment before answering. "You are serious about repaying it?" Naomi looked surprised by the question. "Of course. Most people would not be." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Most people are probably not trying to teach their children responsibility while borrowing money for medicine. The answer settled heavily into the silence between them. The stranger's expression shifted almost invisibly again. Not dramatic. Just enough for Naomi to notice something tired behind his calm exterior. Before either of them spoke further, the woman in the cream-colored coat suddenly cleared her throat nervously. "I did not realize who you were," she said quickly to the stranger. The man looked at her without emotion. "That changed nothing about what you said." Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Naomi stared between them in growing confusion. "Who is he?" she finally asked softly. Nobody answered immediately. Even the cashier hesitated. Then the older man lowered his voice carefully. "That is Mr. Daniel Kong." The name meant nothing to Naomi at first. She simply nodded politely while shifting Ava higher beneath the blanket. But the reaction around her changed instantly. One customer near the greeting card aisle froze completely. Another quietly grabbed his shopping bag and moved toward the exit without speaking. Even the woman in the cream-colored coat looked genuinely frightened now. Naomi frowned slightly. "Should I know who that is?" The cashier looked stunned that she asked the question out loud. Daniel Kong, however, remained perfectly calm. "No," he answered quietly. "You should not." But the cashier could not stop himself from speaking further. "Mr. Kong owns half the buildings around this neighborhood," he whispered carefully. "And a lot more than that." The pharmacy suddenly felt colder. Naomi looked back toward Daniel again, seeing him differently now. The expensive coat. The perfect stillness. The way the room reacted to him without explanation. He did not carry himself like wealthy men she occasionally cleaned apartments for. Those men liked attention. Daniel Kong carried power the way storms carried rain. Quietly. Inevitably. Naomi immediately lowered her eyes. "I am sorry," she said softly, embarrassed without fully understanding why. Daniel's expression narrowed slightly. "For what?" "I did not know who you were when I asked for help." Silence followed the sentence. Then, for the first time all night, something almost resembling disappointment crossed Daniel Kang's face. "Naomi," he said quietly, "you should never apologize for protecting your child." The room went silent again. Even the cashier stopped breathing loudly. Because somehow the most powerful man anyone there had ever met sounded less offended by poverty than everyone else in the pharmacy. Naomi Carter stood quietly beneath the pharmacy lights while Ava slept weakly against her shoulder, trying to process the strange tension surrounding Daniel Kong. The name still felt distant to her, but everyone else in the room reacted as though someone dangerous had just walked in carrying invisible authority. The cashier avoided direct eye contact now. The woman in the cream-colored coat looked almost desperate to disappear. Even the younger man near the refrigerator suddenly stood straighter as though afraid of being noticed. Naomi did not understand that kind of power. The only powerful people she knew were landlords who raised rent and employers who complained if dust remained on a windowsill. Daniel Kong looked nothing like them. He remained calm. Controlled. Almost tired beneath the cold pharmacy lighting. "You should go home," Daniel said quietly to her again. Naomi nodded slowly this time. "I will." But before taking a single step toward the exit, she carefully shifted Ava with one arm and reached into her purse again. Daniel watched her silently. Naomi pulled out 3 damp dollar bills and several quarters before placing them gently on the counter beside the register. "What are you doing?" Daniel asked. "Paying what I can now." The cashier looked startled. "Ma'am, that is not necessary." Naomi ignored him. Her eyes stayed lowered while she carefully straightened the wet bills with exhausted fingers. "I borrowed $11, she said softly. "Not 37. Daniel stared at her for a long moment without speaking. Around them, the pharmacy had become completely silent again. Even the woman who mocked Naomi earlier looked confused now. Most people accepted help greedily when desperate. Naomi still insisted on preserving fairness even while carrying a sick child through the rain. Daniel noticed every detail. "Keep your money," he said quietly. Naomi shook her head immediately. No, the answer surprised even her slightly with how firm it sounded. She swallowed hard before continuing more softly. "I cannot teach my daughter honesty one day if I stop practicing it tonight." The sentence landed heavily inside the room. The cashier slowly looked down at the register while the younger man near the refrigerators lowered his eyes with visible embarrassment. Nobody had treated Naomi with dignity until Daniel stepped forward. Yet somehow she still carried more dignity than anyone else there. Daniel glanced briefly toward the sleeping child in her arms. Ava's tiny coughs had softened now, though fever still warmed her flushed cheeks beneath the blanket. Something inside Daniel tightened unexpectedly at the sight. A memory surfaced before he could stop it. A narrow apartment in Seoul. Winter wind leaking through cracked windows. His own mother sitting beside him when he was 6 years old, counting coins beneath dim kitchen light while pretending not to cry. Daniel blinked once, forcing the memory away before it settled too deeply. Naomi noticed the change in his expression immediately. For the first time all night, the powerful stranger beside her looked less untouchable and more human. "You have a child?" she asked softly before realizing how personal the question sounded. The cashier nearly stopped breathing. Nobody asked Daniel Kong personal questions. But Daniel did not look offended. His gaze lingered briefly on Ava instead. "No," he answered quietly. "But my mother raised one." Naomi frowned slightly, sensing something painful beneath the sentence. Before she could respond, the woman in the cream-colored coat suddenly grabbed her purse. Nervously. "I should go," she muttered quickly. Nobody stopped her. She hurried toward the exit beneath the red glow of the pharmacy sign without looking at anyone again. Rain rushed in briefly when the door opened before slamming shut behind her. Silence settled once more. Daniel looked toward Naomi carefully now. Not as someone beneath him. Not as a problem to solve. But as a woman standing in the middle of humiliation while still protecting her dignity with both hands. And somehow, beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights and the smell of medicine lingering through the store, that affected him more than he expected. The rain outside had softened into a steady whisper by the time Naomi Carter finally moved toward the pharmacy exit. The medicine bag rested carefully beneath one arm while Ava slept quietly against her shoulder, the little girl's breathing calmer now that the fever reducer had begun working. Naomi could already feel the difference. The tension in Ava's tiny body had eased slightly, and for the first time in days, hope no longer felt impossible. Daniel Kong stood near the counter watching silently while Naomi adjusted the blanket around her daughter one more time before reaching for the door handle. Then she stopped. Slowly turning back toward him beneath the fluorescent lights, she reached into her purse again and pulled out a folded receipt. "Can you write your number here?" she asked softly. The cashier nearly dropped a stack of paper bags behind the counter. Daniel looked mildly surprised himself. "Why?" Naomi frowned slightly. "So I can repay you Friday morning." A strange silence followed the sentence. Not awkward. Almost unfamiliar. Daniel stared at her for several seconds before answering. "You are still thinking about $11? Naomi looked genuinely confused by the question. "It matters to me." Daniel glanced toward the wet bills she had already placed on the counter earlier. Then toward the exhausted woman standing in front of him wearing worn sneakers and a hoodie still damp from rain. Most people in Naomi's situation would have focused entirely on survival. She still focused on integrity. It unsettled him in ways he did not fully understand. "You do not owe me anything," he said quietly. Naomi immediately shook her head. "That is not true." Her voice remained soft but steady. "You helped my daughter when nobody else would." The cashier lowered his eyes again, visibly ashamed now. Naomi noticed but chose not to embarrass him further. She understood fear. Understood hesitation. Life had taught her that people often became cold simply because they were afraid of inconvenience touching their own lives. Daniel studied her face carefully while rain tapped against the windows behind them. There was exhaustion in her expression. Hunger probably too. Yet no bitterness. No manipulation. Just tired honesty. Friday, Naomi repeated gently while holding out the receipt and pen toward him. Please. Daniel finally accepted the pen from her hand. His fingers brushed hers briefly. Cold from the rain outside. He wrote a number across the back of the receipt in clean, precise handwriting before handing it back. Naomi folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her purse like something valuable. Thank you, she whispered again. Daniel gave a slight nod. Get home safely. Naomi turned toward the exit once more, but before opening the door, she paused again. Mr. Kong? Daniel looked up. I meant what I said earlier, she told him quietly. I will repay every dollar. Something almost resembling a smile touched the corner of his mouth then. Faint enough that Naomi nearly missed it. I believe you. The answer stayed with her as she stepped out into the cold Brooklyn night. Rain mist drifted through the glow of the streetlights while distant traffic hissed across wet pavement. Naomi pulled the blanket higher around Ava and hurried toward the subway entrance 2 blocks away, her body exhausted but lighter somehow than before. Inside the pharmacy, silence lingered after she disappeared into the rain. The cashier slowly exhaled and looked toward Daniel carefully. Sir, he said quietly, most people would have taken the money and left. Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the empty doorway. She was not asking to be saved, he replied softly. The cashier frowned slightly. Daniel adjusted the cuff of his black coat before continuing in the same calm voice. She was trying to survive without losing herself. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled faintly beyond the city skyline. And for reasons Daniel Kong could not fully explain yet, the image of Naomi Carter walking into the rain holding medicine for her child refused to leave his mind. Naomi Carter did not remember the subway ride home clearly afterward. Exhaustion blurred everything together into scattered flashes of wet train windows, dim station lights, and Ava sleeping quietly against her chest beneath the faded blanket. But one thing stayed painfully clear in her mind the entire ride back to Queens. Daniel Kang's final words inside the pharmacy. She was trying to survive without losing herself. Nobody had ever described her life that way before. Most people only saw the struggle. The unpaid bills. The second-hand clothes. The exhaustion. They rarely noticed how hard she fought to keep dignity alive underneath all of it. By the time Naomi climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment above the laundromat, rainwater had soaked through her sneakers completely. Her legs ached from 12 hours of cleaning houses across Brooklyn, and every step up the staircase felt heavier than the last. Inside the apartment, the air was cold enough to make her shiver immediately. The small radiator near the kitchen clicked weakly but produced almost no heat. Naomi gently laid Ava down on the old couch beneath 2 blankets before quickly opening the pharmacy bag with trembling hands. The fever medicine bottle rattled softly in the silence of the apartment. Naomi carefully measured the dosage with exhausted concentration while Ava stirred weakly in her sleep. Come on, baby, Naomi whispered gently while brushing curls away from her daughter's forehead. Just a little. Ava swallowed the medicine slowly before curling back against the pillow with a tired sigh. Naomi sat beside her on the couch afterward, one hand resting lightly against the little girl's chest just to feel the steady rhythm of her breathing. Minutes passed quietly. Then slowly, almost unbelievably, the tension in Ava's tiny body began easing. Her breathing softened first. Then the painful warmth in her forehead started fading little by little beneath Naomi's hand. Naomi closed her eyes instantly, overwhelmed by relief so powerful it nearly hurt. She had been holding fear inside her chest for days without realizing how heavy it became until this moment. A small cough escaped Ava's lips one final time before the child finally settled into deep sleep. Peaceful sleep. The kind Naomi had been praying for since the fever started. Tears rose unexpectedly behind Naomi's eyes. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. Exhausted ones. She leaned forward slowly, pressing her forehead against the edge of the couch beside her sleeping daughter while emotion shook silently through her body. Outside the apartment window, rain tapped softly against the glass while distant sirens echoed through the city far below. Naomi looked toward the medicine bottle sitting on the coffee table beneath weak yellow lamplight. $11. Such a small amount to people living in luxury apartments across Manhattan tonight. But for her, those $11 had changed everything. Ava shifted gently in her sleep again, then reached one tiny hand toward Naomi without waking fully. Naomi immediately held it. "I am here," she whispered softly. The little girl's fingers curled around hers instinctively before relaxing again. Naomi sat there a long time afterward, simply watching her daughter breathe. The apartment remained cold. Bills still sat unpaid inside the kitchen drawer. Tomorrow morning she still needed to wake before sunrise for another cleaning shift. None of her problems had magically disappeared. But tonight her child was safe. And somehow that changed the darkness inside the room. Across the city meanwhile, Daniel Kong stood alone beside the massive windows of his penthouse office overlooking Manhattan while rain streaked silently down the glass. A half-finished drink rested untouched beside him. The skyline glittered beneath storm clouds stretching across the river, but Daniel barely noticed it. His mind remained fixed on one image only. Naomi Carter standing beneath pharmacy lights insisting on repaying $11 while holding her sick child through the rain. And for reasons he could not explain yet, the memory unsettled him far more deeply than violence, money, or power ever had. Friday morning arrived colder than expected. Thin gray clouds hung low above Queens while freezing rain drifted across the sidewalks outside Naomi Carter's apartment building. Inside the small room above the laundromat, the radiator still clicked uselessly beside the wall, but for the first time in days, Ava slept peacefully beneath her blankets without fever burning through her tiny body. Naomi stood quietly near the kitchen counter buttoning the sleeves of her faded work uniform while watching her daughter breathe. The relief still felt fragile somehow, as if she might wake up and discover the entire pharmacy night had only been desperation mixed with exhaustion. But the medicine bottle sitting beside the sink reminded her it had been real. Daniel Kong had been real too. Naomi slipped 11 carefully folded dollars into a small white envelope before placing it inside her purse. She had spent 2 extra hours cleaning offices before sunrise just to make sure the money was ready exactly when promised. Some people would have called it foolish. Naomi called it peace of mind. Across Manhattan meanwhile, Daniel Kong sat alone at the head of a long black conference table while men in expensive suits discussed property acquisitions around him. Their voices blended together into meaningless background noise. Numbers. Contracts. Expansion plans. Daniel barely heard any of it. His attention drifted instead toward the rain crawling slowly down the skyscraper windows behind them. "Sir," one of the executives asked cautiously. Daniel blinked once and looked up. "Continue." The room obeyed immediately. Nobody questioned distraction from Daniel Kong. Men feared him too much for that. Yet even while listening to million-dollar negotiations, Daniel still found himself thinking about a woman counting damp dollar bills beneath fluorescent pharmacy lights. It irritated him slightly. Not because Naomi Carter mattered strategically. She did not. But because she reminded him of things he spent years training himself not to feel anymore. Humility. Struggle. Humanity without performance. A soft knock interrupted the meeting. One of Daniel's assistants stepped inside carrying a folder. "Sorry to interrupt, sir," the man said carefully. "The pharmacy owner from Brooklyn called this morning." Daniel's expression shifted subtly. "Why?" "He said the woman from the other night returned." Silence settled instantly around the conference table. The executives exchanged confused glances while Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. "Returned?" "To repay the $11. Something almost invisible moved through Daniel's eyes. Not surprise exactly. Confirmation. Did she leave the money? The assistant nodded. In an envelope with your name written on it. Nobody at the conference table understood why the room suddenly felt different after those words. But Daniel did. Naomi Carter could have disappeared after that night. Most people would have. $11 meant nothing to him financially. Yet somehow the fact she returned it exactly as promised affected him more than multi-million-dollar business deals ever could. Daniel stood slowly from his chair. Every executive in the room immediately fell silent. Reschedule the rest of today's meetings, he said calmly. Several men looked stunned but quickly nodded anyway. Nobody argued with Daniel Kong. As the others gathered their documents nervously, Daniel walked toward the windows overlooking the rain-covered skyline. Sir, the assistant asked carefully, would you like the envelope brought here? Daniel remained silent several seconds before answering. No, his reflection stared back at him through the glass. Calm face. Controlled posture. Expensive suit tailored perfectly around a life built on power and discipline. Yet somewhere inside that carefully constructed world, the image of Naomi Carter handing over $11 she could barely afford had already begun changing something he thought disappeared from him years ago. Respect. Genuine respect. And Daniel Kong realized with quiet disbelief that he could not remember the last time another human being earned it so honestly. 3 nights later. Naomi Carter returned to the pharmacy after finishing another late cleaning shift in Manhattan. Snow flurries drifted softly through the Brooklyn streets now, replacing the cold rain from earlier that week. Her body ached from scrubbing marble kitchen floors inside luxury apartments all day, but Ava's fever had finally disappeared completely. That alone made every exhausting hour feel lighter. Naomi stepped inside the pharmacy carrying a small folded receipt in one hand while Ava slept peacefully in a stroller beside her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead exactly the same way they had the night everything changed, but the atmosphere felt completely different now. The cashier noticed her immediately. Miss Carter, he said with visible surprise. Naomi smiled politely. Hi. The older man glanced toward the stroller. Your daughter looks much better. Naomi's expression softened instantly. She is. The cashier nodded slowly before reaching beneath the counter. Actually, there is something I need to tell you. Naomi frowned slightly. The man pulled out a pharmacy statement folder and opened it carefully beneath the register light. Your prescription balance has already been paid. Naomi blinked in confusion. What? Not just the last visit, the cashier clarified quietly. The next 6 months of medication too. Naomi stared at him without speaking. There must be a mistake. The cashier shook his head immediately. No mistake. He hesitated briefly before lowering his voice. The Korean gentleman handled it personally. Silence settled around the counter. Naomi slowly looked down at the stroller where Ava slept peacefully beneath a pink blanket, completely unaware that strangers were quietly changing her future. Why would he do that? Naomi whispered. The cashier gave a faint shrug. He did not explain. Naomi's chest tightened unexpectedly. She had spent most of her adult life surviving entirely on her own. Nobody paid bills for people like her. Nobody quietly removed burdens without asking for attention in return. He also arranged a delivery yesterday, the cashier added carefully. Naomi looked up quickly. Delivery? Groceries. Formula. Children's. Medicine. Naomi froze completely. Yesterday morning she had opened her apartment door to find several grocery bags sitting outside with no note attached. She assumed the downstairs neighbors received the wrong delivery by accident. That was him? The cashier nodded slowly. Naomi gripped the edge of the counter tighter while emotion rose painfully into her throat. Not because of the money, but because Daniel Kong had somehow noticed every struggle she tried hardest to hide from the world. The cashier watched her carefully before speaking again. You know, he said quietly, I judged you that night. Naomi lowered her eyes immediately. Most people did. Still, he continued softly, I should not have. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly between them. The older man glanced toward Ava sleeping peacefully inside the stroller. Mr. Kong said something before he left the pharmacy that night. Naomi looked up slowly. What? The cashier hesitated as though replaying the memory carefully. He said people become dangerous when they stop recognizing the humanity of struggling mothers. Naomi felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. She turned away quickly before the cashier could fully see it. For several long seconds, she simply stood there staring through the front pharmacy windows at snow drifting softly across the dark Brooklyn sidewalk outside. Her entire life, poverty had made her feel invisible unless she inconvenienced someone. But Daniel Kong had looked directly at her exhaustion, her fear, her desperation, and somehow still treated her with dignity instead of judgment. That realization hurt in a completely different way. The cashier quietly slid another small envelope across the counter toward her. He left this too. Naomi stared at the envelope with trembling hands. Her name was written across the front in clean, precise handwriting she recognized immediately. And suddenly, standing beneath the same harsh pharmacy lights where she once begged strangers for $11, Naomi Carter realized that the most powerful man she had ever met had given her something far more frightening than money. He had reminded her what kindness felt like. Naomi Carter waited. Nearly 2 days before opening the envelope Daniel Kong left for her at the pharmacy. Not because she was ungrateful. Because kindness that large frightened her a little. Life had taught her that generosity usually arrived attached to expectations, debt, or humiliation waiting quietly around the corner. But late Sunday evening, after Ava finally fell asleep on the couch beside the old radiator, Naomi sat alone at the small kitchen table beneath dim yellow light and carefully unfolded the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was not money. Not business cards. Not instructions. Just a single sheet of paper with one sentence written in clean, precise handwriting. Your daughter should grow up seeing kindness more often than fear. Naomi stared at the words for a very long time without moving. Outside the apartment window, soft snow drifted quietly through the Queens streets while distant sirens echoed somewhere far below. Ava shifted peacefully beneath her blanket nearby, healthy again. Safe again. Naomi pressed the paper gently against the table and closed her eyes briefly as emotion tightened painfully in her chest. Nobody had protected her dignity like this before. Nobody had helped without demanding ownership over the help afterward. The following Friday evening, Naomi stood once again outside the Brooklyn pharmacy beneath softly falling snow with Ava bundled warmly inside her stroller. But this time she was not exhausted. Nervous, yes. But something calmer had replaced the desperation from that first night. The pharmacist noticed her immediately and gave a small respectful nod. He is here, the older man said quietly. Naomi's heart stumbled once inside her chest. Daniel Kong stood near the back refrigerators wearing the same dark wool coat from the rainy night they met, one hand resting inside his pocket while quietly reading something on his phone. He looked exactly the same. Calm. Controlled. Untouchable somehow. Yet Naomi no longer felt afraid of him. Daniel looked up as she approached. For a moment neither of them spoke. Snowflakes melted quietly against the pharmacy windows behind them while Ava reached sleepily toward Naomi's scarf from inside the stroller. Naomi carefully pulled a small white envelope from her purse and held it toward him. Daniel glanced at it once. What is that? $11, Naomi answered softly. Again. Something faint moved across Daniel's face. Almost amusement. Almost admiration. Naomi, he said quietly, you already repaid it. She shook her head gently. No. I repaid a loan. Her eyes lowered briefly toward the envelope in her hands before lifting back to him. This one is for reminding me that decent people still exist. Silence settled softly between them. Not uncomfortable silence. Something quieter. Heavier. Daniel looked at the woman standing in front of him beneath harsh pharmacy lights wearing second-hand boots and a worn winter coat while still carrying more grace than most wealthy people he had known his entire life. Then his gaze drifted toward Ava sleeping peacefully beneath the blanket. The child whose fever brought Naomi into his life over $11. Daniel accepted the envelope slowly this time. Not because he needed the money. Because refusing it would dishonor the dignity Naomi fought so hard to protect. "Your mother taught you well," he said softly. Naomi smiled faintly. "She used to say poverty can take many things from people." Daniel waited quietly. Naomi looked down at Ava before finishing. "But only if you let it take your character too." The snow outside continued falling gently while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. For the first time in years, Daniel Kong felt something unfamiliar settle inside the silence surrounding him. Not power. Not fear. Peace. And standing there beneath cold pharmacy lights with a sleeping child nearby and $11 resting quietly inside his coat pocket, a man feared across half the city finally remembered what humanity felt like. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes kindness can change a life.